In this class, we will talk about the supply side of urban tourism. In other words, we will discuss the tourist assets, or in a more complex phrase, the urban tourism attraction system. The first chapter in the tourist assets is indeed about tourism resources. Which things, building blocks, do you have to make your urban destination? As a policymaker, as a destination developer, you want to show something to the world. You want to lure visitors, to attract visitors to your city, and it's not an easy thing to do. So there's several ways of thinking about what aspects do you have in your destination that could be attractive for tourists. And we're going to talk about four ways of division. Four models is a big word, but four basic ways of thinking on urban tourism resources. The first one is about the distinction between primary, secondary, and tertiary elements. The second one is about elements that make cultural cities. The third thing is a basic distinction between global and local elements. And finally, we're going to talk about the 6 A's of tourism destinations, on which we're also going to do an assignment. There has been an interesting research done by Judd Winter, Barnes and Stern in 2003, and they did a survey amongst 458 US cities, and they asked those cities, which facilities do you have, or which facilities do you want to develop, do you think are important to be developed, if you're talking about urban tourism. Now, as you can see here in the table, almost every city wants to develop or has developed events. About 96% thinks events are important to attract tourists. Also, 3/4 of the respondents, they have historic districts or want to develop historic sites because they think these are places that are interesting to tourists. Museums are third on the list. Of course, museums in urban destinations are important, and as you can see in this table, about 70% of all the cities are thinking about building or exploiting museums to attract tourists. Now, maybe something weird on the fourth place, but weird because it's probably a typical US thing, are the farmers market. These are the markets where you can buy stuff from the farmer right away from the farm, and this is very important in some major US cities. And further down on the list are things like performing arts centers, entertainment, restaurant districts, cultural districts, hotels, convention centers, theme parks, casinos even, and so on. Now, what is important is that when you talk about cities, there's not just one element that attracts people. There can be, of course, like the Eiffel Tower in Paris, but most of the cities have a multiplicity of things to see and do. And it is a concentration, the variety, the qualities of all these activities, all these attributes that create attractions. And that's why cities are investing in more than just one activity, more than just one attribute. Now, there's a very interesting model. It's a Belgian model, actually, that already dates back to the 80s. It's basic, but it still gives a clear view on how you can divide the tourism assets, the tourism resources in a destination, in an urban destination. Now, this model talks about three types of elements. The first type are the primary elements, and these are basically the elements that attracts tourists. These are the reasons to come, the major things that people are looking for when they go to a city. And Jan Verbeek is talking about activity places like cultural facilities, cinemas, exhibitions, and so on. Also, sports and amusement are supposed to be in there as major points of attraction for tourists. And on the other hand, in the primary elements, there's also leisure settings, like monuments and statues and harbors, and friendliness, also the language of a place, local customs, and so on and so forth. Now, opposed to the primary elements are the secondary elements that are important to shape the tourist experience, but that are not attraction elements, attraction resources, to say, as such. So they are important to shape the tourist experience, but they're not attracting tourists on their own. And Jan Sander-Beke is talking about shopping, markets, and hotel catering facilities. Now finally, there's the additional elements. In some models are talking about tertiary elements, and these additional elements are the elements that are helping the tourist, but that are not very important for the tourist experience. Things like parking facilities, accessibility, information offices, guides, maps, and so on. Now, of course, this model dates back from the 80s, so this is a little bit outdated, and it's also not very easy to put into practice. For instance, there's a lot of cities where shopping facilities are the main attraction, and not secondary elements. And another point, for instance, another critique that you can give is that some guides or information offices are becoming more and more important as experience centers, visitor centers, and are becoming at least secondary elements and not additional elements. But for what it's worth, this is quite a basic but interesting scheme that's dividing and trying to divide the elements of tourism, the resources of tourism in an urban destination, into three types. Now another one is presented by Münsters, and this is about cultural cities. And what is interesting here is that he's also talking about three types of elements, but he's putting the core attractions, and you can see it visually from the scheme, are the cultural attractions, at least in cultural cities. And also important is not just the cultural attractions, but also the information and education. So the information, for instance, with Jan Sander-Beke was in the additional elements, and here Münsters puts it at the core. So that's a major difference, and of course this is just part of interpretation amongst academics. And Münster is also talking about second ring, the facilities and the services, everything that shapes the experience. This is more or less likewise the secondary elements from Jan Sander-Beke. Things like banks, shops, travel agencies, tourist organizations, offices, and so on. You can see here more elements than in the model of Jan Sander-Beke, but that's just not the core of what I'm trying to say here. And finally, the third ring are everything that has to do with getting there. Transportation infrastructure, car, coach, accessibility, signposting, boat, taxi, and so on. Now another interesting distinction when you look at the tourist resources in cities are the fact if it's global or local. Now the picture above from Starbucks is definitely something global. This refers to a global brand that you can find in almost every Western city, now even in Brussels or in Antwerp. And it's still a part of tourism. So Starbucks is a tourist element because there's many tourists going there, but at the same time it's nothing local. Now the opposite is the picture on the bottom, where you can see this is a picture of strawberry fields in New York Central Park, very near to the building where, actually in front of the building where John Lennon was murdered. And this is so local because it's the place where he was murdered. And this type of local elements are also major attraction points for tourists. Now, the third picture in the middle is actually in the middle because it's a global brand, McDonald's, that is making local efforts, trying to be local. And you can see it at the signs here under the M from McDonald's that are definitely Chinese. And this is Chinatown, actually Chinatown in New York. So you can see there's three types of elements. There's global, there's local, and maybe what we can call local elements that shape urban tourism and the attraction of urban tourism. And finally, this is the scheme that we want to get to, is the typical very basic model of the 6 A's. And what it says is that there's 6 things that are important if you look at the tourist resources. First of all are the attractions. This is basic. This is attractions like the Eiffel Tower, attractions like the Atomium, Manakapis, and so on. Second one are also the activities. People sometimes go to places to hike, to bike, to do boat tours, and so on. So activities can be a major tourist resource. Another aspect of tourist resource is the accessibility. This comes back in almost every scheme that we talked about today. Accessibility to reach the destination, so from the market of origin of the visitor to the destination, it's one point of accessibility, but also the internal accessibility. Can you park there? Can you take a boat? Can you take a tram? And so on. A fourth aspect are what is called the amenities, and amenities are more or less comparable to the secondary elements from Janssen Verbeke. These are the aspects that shape the tourist experience and that are there to give the tourist a comfortable feeling, like things like accommodation or gastronomy. These are typical examples of amenities. A fifth one are the available packages. Now this is a rather confusing level because it's a package, so it's combining several stuff that's mentioned above. But the basic idea here is that a tourist resource is also the bundling of services, the bundling of products, of tourism products, that's important. And a typical way of bundling things is guided tours. So I put a picture there of the Brussels greeters, greeters that are local people who are no official guides, but they're taking tourists around in Brussels city. And finally, the 6th A is of ancillary services, and ancillary services means additional services that are important for the local population, that are not there per se for tourism, but that are important also for tourists. For instance, hospitals or post offices. These are things that are there for local residents, but are also of use for tourists. So the 6 A's of tourism resources in destinations and urban destinations, destinations in general, but also urban destinations, are the attractions, the activities, accessibility, the amenities, available packages, and ancillary services. We're going to use this basic divide for the next assignments. The second chapter of the second module is about the resources and the attraction system. We're going to see a small definition on tourism precincts, some examples of tourism precincts, and some types of tourism precincts. There's 2 models here, the model of the tourism business district and the model of the tourist opportunity spectrum. Now, typical for cities is that most attractions and other functions are concentrated within a certain area, and these areas, these zones, they have a particular characteristic, as Haylor, Griffin, and Edwards say, a spatial, cultural, social, and economic identity. Now, many authors use different names. They call it a tourism precinct, or a tourism district, a tourism zone, a tourism area. It all more or less means the same, a concentration of tourist-related land uses, activities, and visitation within quite well-definable boundaries, with a distinctive character and with a connection to cultural groups, physical or architectural fabrics, activities and land uses, and so on. The location of the tourist attractions in the inner city of Amsterdam illustrate very well that tourism functions are concentrated in a tourism area or a tourism precinct. Let's take a look at this zone. When you look at it, there's a lot of things to see and do on a small area. There's a sex museum and a red light district, a tattoo museum, a hash and marijuana museum, an historical museum, a beguinage, and so on. In the south, there's also some tourism functions concentrated. Well, these are actually more cultural functions, but of course with a major tourism attraction potential. So the map of tourist attractions of the inner city of Amsterdam illustrates the concept of tourist areas or tourist precincts. The first type of tourist precinct is the tourist shopping village. This is a scheme of Maasmechelen shopping village, which is a constructed shopping village, which means that it is entirely planned and developed by a developer, and it has a look and feel of an urban area, but in fact it's a big shopping mall. Shopping villages don't always have to be constructed like shopping malls. This is an example of a naturally evolved shopping area in a city, the city of Marrakesh in Morocco, where there's a souk, which is one big shopping area, one shop next to the other, targeting locals, aiming at tourists. So souks are typical tourist shopping villages, tourism precincts with shopping as the main function there. The second type of tourism precincts are the ethnic precincts. And ethnic precincts are tourism zones where ethnicity is the main tourist attraction. And there's some well-known examples of that. For instance, Little Italy in New York, the picture on the left on top of the slide, but also Chinatown in New York on the bottom. There's many other cities that have a Chinatown, not only in New York. And an example from close by is Matonge, the African area in Brussels that has a lot of tourism potential and where a lot of tourists are actually going there to experience the ethnic quarter. A third type of tourism precincts are the cultural precincts. And these are zones where cultural functions are the major tourism attractions. Two examples on this slide. On top is a picture of Das Museum Insel, the museum island in Berlin, where there's many museums concentrated in a small area, and there's a lot of tourists that go there, as you can see in the picture. On the bottom of the slide is a picture of the environment of Times Square in New York City, where a lot of cultural facilities like movie theaters and opera theaters and other places, other functions can be found, and that are really tourist attraction spot. There's millions and millions of tourists going there every day, every night. So this is a really good example of a cultural precinct. The fourth type of tourism precinct is the entertainment precinct. An entertainment precinct is an area where entertainment functions are the main tourist attraction. Like in Las Vegas, there's casinos, there's nightlife that is very important for tourism. And the picture on top is the strip of Las Vegas. This is the tourism zone with all the entertainment functions are concentrated. On the bottom on the left is Temple Bar in Dublin, where also a lot of nightlife takes place, pubs, restaurants, theaters, and so on. And this is a real tourist attraction spot. It's one big designated area in the city where a lot of tourists and locals come and go. Third example is the environment of Rockefeller Center in New York City, where you have again some entertainment attractions like NBC Studios, and it's a real tourist spot as well in the city of New York. The next type of tourism precinct is what literature calls red light districts and bohemian quarters, and the best example you can find around is the one in Paris, Montmartre, where On the bottom you can see the artistic functions that have a tourist attraction, and on top the Moulin Rouge and the other more red light sex industries that are an attraction for tourists, and they are very closely related to each other in distance and also in history. On the left is another type of red light district, very well known, the red light district of Amsterdam, which is one of the main tourism attractions in the whole city of Amsterdam. Another type of tourism precincts is what is known as the festival marketplace. Festival marketplace are tourist areas that used to be marketplaces, and one of the prime examples is Quincy Market, the picture here on top, Quincy Market in Boston, an old marketplace that has now been redeveloped into a food court where you can find some shops. So it's a real tourist attraction point. Most festival marketplaces can be found in the UK or in the US, but also on the continent you can find one like here in Sevilla, where again an old marketplace has been transformed into mostly food court and with some nice shops around there. A final type of tourism precinct is the World Heritage Site. Huge attraction spot for tourists, World Heritage, and this can be everything. Now the picture on the slide is one of the very few examples of the intangible World Heritage Sites in the world. It's Jemaa el Fna in Marrakesh in Morocco, where a lot of local people go, where there's a lot of local functions, local activities, and you can eat there, you can drink there, you can see people dancing, you can see people telling stories, people doing funny things with snakes, people giving tattoos and so on. And it's a really coming and going of locals and tourists. This is one of the main tourist attraction spots in the city of Marrakesh. We have seen several types of tourism precincts, but there's many more. In fact, there's a huge variation in tourism precincts. You can have old or young precincts. You can have precincts that have been planned and developed, or precincts that just naturally evolved into a tourism zone. You can have precincts that have just the purpose of tourism, or you can have precincts that have many other functions and many other purposes, like culture. Location can differ. You can have precincts in the middle of the city center, or at the edge of the city. And finally, the type of tourism can differ. For instance, restaurants, shopping, and so on. You can have several types of tourists there. Now, the main dimensions are mentioned in the table. The main dimensions to distinguish tourism zones. The first one is the question whether a tourist zone existed before tourism was there, or is just constructed. When it's constructed, then it's planned, developed, and constructed from scratch. Typically, you can think about things like waterfront areas, shopping malls, and so on. When it's existing, it kind of naturally evolved in the city into a tourism zone. The second one is about the diversity of functions. So when there's only tourism, we talk about monolithic tourist bubbles. It's a bubble in the city aiming at tourists and tourists only. However, if there's also other functions like residential functions, governments, and so on, we talk about complex multifunctional precincts. Now, here, this type of precincts, existing complex multifunctional precincts, that's typical for tourist historic cities in Western Europe. An interesting model that tries to conceptualize tourism zones is the one of Donald Getz, and he uses the term tourism business district. And tourism business district is the area that comprises three types of functions: the core tourist attractions, the essential services like catering and accommodation, and the CBD functions, the functions that can typically be found in the central business district like offices and retail. And what Getz is saying, and Getz is a North American author, so you have to think of this type of cities. What he's saying is that the tourism business district, the attraction system, the attraction spot of the city, is the whole of these three types of functions. And he adds two more functions, sorry. First one is access to this area. The second one is access within the area. As he describes one type of cities, he says that access has to be within pedestrian distance, so he talks about pedestrian access. And the whole of the zone that comprises these functions within pedestrian distance, within walking distance, this is for Donald Katz the tourism business district. A second model is the one of Janssen Verbeken and Livois, who did a study on the tourist attraction of heritage clusters in historic cities. And their concept is the one of a tourist opportunity spectrum, the spectrum of opportunities that tourists have to do and visit and see, or other words, the tourist activity space, the space they have to undertake tourist activities. And this tourist opportunity spectrum has several components: accessibility, as it says here, accessibility, but also the environmental characteristics of everything that surrounds is important for the opportunity spectrum, the core elements of tourism, the secondary elements of tourism. All these together make the tourist opportunity spectrum. Now, what they add in the model is the fact that the tourist opportunity spectrum is a function of two things: the morphological positioning index and the functional index. Now, the morphological positioning index is about two things again: the distance between tourist attraction points and tourism functions in general, and secondly, the critical mass of tourism zones. That is how many tourists are there and how many tourist functions are there in a tourism area. Secondly, the functional index is about two things as well: the tourist access and the accessibility. If it's well accessible, you can get a high score on the functional index. And secondly, the functional diversity. If a tourism zone has many functions, is multifunctional, it has a higher score on the functional index. And what they say is that the tourist attraction increases when the morphological positioning index increases, so when the zone of tourism has more tourist attractions and tourism functions, and when the functional index increases, so when the tourist accessibility and the multifunctionality increases. So complex tourist areas that are multifunctional and that are well accessible, these have, according to the authors here, the most attractive value for tourists. The third chapter in the module on tourism assets is on the tourist historic city, which is a concept where a lot of authors have written about and where you can find a lot of literature on. The tourist historic city is a concept that was launched by Ashworth and Tunbridge, and it's about the tourist area, and they call it the tourist city, within typical historic cities as you can find them in Western Europe, but also in Asia and so on. And what they say is that when you look at the city, you can see different areas. For instance, in Amsterdam, you see some functional districts on this map with culture areas or restaurant areas, shopping areas, and even sex industry areas. And the central business district with the main offices, that's this region. That's these areas. And what they say is that the tourist city is actually part of this commercial city, and on the one hand, and the historic city on the other hand. That's illustrated in this model, where you can find the tourist city as an overlap of the commercial city, or at least parts of it, and the historic city, or at least parts of it. So when you look at the tourist functions within the city of Amsterdam, you can indeed see that it is within a zone that is part of the CBD, part of these industrial, like cultural areas, restaurant areas, and parts of the historic areas. So it is very interesting is that the tourist city is an overlap of both the historic city and the commercial city, or certain areas within it. Next to the geographical boundaries of a tourist city, which is the overlap of parts of the historic city and parts of the commercial city, is the evolutionary character of the model. Ashworth and Tunbridge, they say that there's 4 stages of the development of a tourist city. And the first one, you have the original city here with the CBD, the central business district, in the middle of the city. In the second phase, due to all kinds of technological, social, economic developments, the central business district moves away from the historical city, from its historical core, and the historic city is what is left. In a third phase, tourism starts to develop, and the tourist city then is not the entire city, it's not the entire CBD, nor the entire historic city. It's part of the CBD, and it's a part of the historic city, and this altogether is in fact the tourist city. Now in the fourth phase, the CBD still expands, becomes bigger, the historic city also expands, so the tourist city can change of character. For instance, the number of CBD functions in tourist cities nowadays within historic cities, the number of CBD functions is diminishing, which means that in many cities now the tourist city only has a very small part of the CBD in its zone. Another illustration next to the one of Amsterdam is the city of Bruges, which is a typical historic city, and the ancient historic city is this one. These are the ancient city walls, the second city walls around the city, and when most Belgians talk about Bruges, they talk about this historic city where about 20,000 people are living. Now, the real tourist city, though, is just part of this historic city, is this one. Yeah? And here, most of the tourism functions are concentrated. The hotels, the musea, the shopping, the restaurants, and so on. Souvenir shops, horse and carriage tours, guided walks, and so on. All these functions are concentrated within just 1 square kilometer, where about 5,000 people are living. But also in this zone you have some CBD functions, like government buildings. Not all of them anymore, though, because most of the government buildings and other CBD functions moved out in this direction and in this direction. So what you can see is that the tourist city is indeed part of the historic city and part of the CBD that moved away from the historic city. Now the tourism zone of, or the tourism precinct, the tourist area of the historic city of Bruges is called the Golden Triangle and is commonly known as this triangle. It's gold because you can make a lot of money from tourism there, and it's a triangle because it has 3 points. Now, I call it the golden ice cream because there's some kind of ball on top of it where you also have a lot of tourism functions. But we have to say that about 85 to 90% of tourism functions are concentrated within this ice cream. And let's take a look at the development of the hotel capacity, the number of beds in the period between 1971 and 2002. That's this graph here, this graph. Well, you can see that in 1971 there were about 1,800 beds within this area in the city of Bruges. In 2002 there were about 6,600 beds with just aiming at tourists within this golden triangle. So this means that you have an explosion of tourism functions within the historic city of Bruges and within this tourism zone, all concentrated in just one area of 1 square kilometer. Another map again to illustrate the density of tourism functions within a certain zone of the city of Bruges. When you look at the map here, you can see that most of the restaurants, pubs and bars, fast food and hotels are concentrated within this area, with a small exception here where you now have a concentration, a younger concentration of trendy restaurants, and then some restaurants spotted all over the town. And it's even more visible that there's a concentration of tourism functions within this golden triangle. When you look at the souvenir shops, the tourist shops, which are all situated in the middle of the city, and just a very, very few can be found in the rest of the city. And just to show you the golden ice cream and how well this overlaps with say about 90 to 95% of the tourism functions within the city of Bruges. Now we have to go back to one of the first slides with the definition of the tourism precinct, and it says that the tourism precinct has a clear distinctive characteristic with a lot of tourist functions, concentration of tourism functions, and the second aspect of the definition was that it also has clear distinctive boundaries. And here the golden triangle in Bruges, that's the boundary of it, the official boundary, while the blue lines, the blue streets, are the answers of local people on the question, where is the tourist area of Bruges? And they had to draw it on a map, and about 23 local people, almost everyone agreed on the zone of tourism, on the tourism precinct, which actually means that tourism precincts can be seen and felt in space. So it's not just a concentration of functions to show it on a map, but it's also a mental map in people's minds and people's heads. And when you ask those local people, why do you say that the tourism zone is this area? Why do you think the tourism zone is confined to this precinct? Well, they blame it on several things. They blame it on, or they say typically, characteristically for these areas is things like this and this, the chocolatier and the tourist cards, because these are tourist functions. That's one way of characterizing tourism areas or tourism precincts. But the second one is also the people that are there. And this is interesting because locals distinguish a tourism zone by the people walking around there, by the tourists, and they characterize tourists by having a photograph camera, or by wearing white bags with souvenirs, or by wearing white sneakers, by wearing comfortable clothing, rucksacks, and other stuff. And another aspect of why tourists are considered as tourists is the fact that they are walking in the middle of the street. Now, local people say that local people don't walk in the middle of the street, while tourists do walk in the middle of the street. So in fact, to sum it up, the boundaries of a tourism zone are characterized by the tourist functions visible in space, but also by the people. So a tourism precinct is not just a matter of functions, it's also a matter of people walking around there. The tourist historic city model has many variants, and we just discussed the city port variant because many cities in Western Europe are situated near a river and have port functions. Now, the evolutionary model of the city port is more or less the same as the evolutionary model of the tourist historic city. In the first phase, there's a CBD and an original city, and as you can see, the difference with the tourist historic city model here is that the circles are just half a circle, because of course there's a river with port functions. In the second phase, the CBD moves away from the river, leaving behind the historic city. The reason why the CBD moves out is that the port functions, they disappear, and they move more downstream, down to where the sea is, because there the river is deep and the boats can be bigger. In the third phase, as with the tourist historic city model, the tourist city appears and it's part of the historic city and part of the CBD. Now the big difference is within phase 4. Within phase 4 of the tourist historic city model, the CBD expands and moves away even more from the historic city, leaving behind a bigger historic city and more potential interest for tourist city. Now, with the city port, the CBD moves back in to the historic city. Indeed, in many city ports, you can see that functions that are normally situated within a CBD come back to the water in waterfront areas and so on. And why is that? Because the water is now again attractive for all kinds of functions, also CBD functions and tourist functions. So in the end, you get a tourist city that just has some minor parts of the historic city and is more or less overlapping with the central business district, because this central business district and the historic city have become closer again, which is the big difference with the tourist historic city model. The tourist historic city is just one model of the geography of urban tourism. It's an important one because many of the Western European cities have a historic center, have a CBD, and have a tourism zone that is part of the historic center and part of the CBD. But there's also other models and other cities, and we'll just discuss one type, the postmodern tourist city, we call it. And typical for postmodern cities is that there's a lot of zones and a lot of neighborhoods where you can find different functions. And tourism can be in theme parks all around the city, or in shopping malls, or in spectacle areas where you can have theaters and so on. Now this is a typical model for the city of Los Angeles, where the city is spread out and there is a central business district and there is a city center, but most of the things are happening outside this center. So when you look then at a typical postmodern city, you have the central business district with tourism attractions, with tourism functions, tourist attractions here, accommodation, tourist shopping also, and festival sites. At the edge of the CBD and also already spreading within the rest of the city are entertainment districts. There's a waterfront zone stretching out from the CBD and even outwards alongside the river where the former port area was. And there's shopping malls and entertainment complexes in suburbs. There's ethnic minorities with ethnic suburbs and ethnic zones that could be of interest for tourism. There's the zone around the airport where you can have a lot of tourism facilities. There could be convention centers and cultural cities and so on. So typical for a postmodern tourist city is that the tourism city, the tourist area, is dispersed. There are several zones within the city that have tourism functions, which is a major difference of the tourist historic city, where tourism is concentrated in just one zone that is part of the historic city and the CBD.